Well, today we continue with the session following Alberto's, and mine is about the construction of personal selves. So my topic, the title of my paper is Collectivity from Within, referring on the construction of multiple selves within one, something that I've spoken about yesterday, kind of announced it yesterday, and today I would like to speak in more depth and more breadth, but also with more precision, about a theory of subjectivity that I devised through research, through observation, and observing socio-political and economic trends in the global world these days, especially and in particularly the global movement and migration of women. I will go back to that quickly and set up the socio-political and economic context for it. But I do want to refer quickly to Alberto's presentation because he set up my speech really well. He gave multiple examples, but he also spoke particularly about regulating the society over a woman's body. So he spoke about cultures and societies regulating and organizing their order by regulating, disciplining, monitoring a woman's body. So in that sense, a woman's body becomes the site of questing for and questioning of community. And that's something that's very important to me, and this is why I chose the topic of women's subjectivity as a potential model for modern subjectivity. And I'll explain why I use that word in comparison to individuality in a minute. But woman's body, as we have noticed across cultures, even in the current moment in history, has become or has been a place and our site for questing for legitimacy of community. Through father's name, through having to have a child legitimized, from that to calling a country a motherland, associating a woman's body with a land or a place of origin, of course, as well as all the way to monitoring her body, the way her body is exposed or not, is also reflecting on the values of the culture. Primarily, is she covered, uncovered, how she's dressed, what is the proper way of going out or not going out, and in what attire, as well as the means of controlling her reproductive system. And it's, like I said, across cultures, we currently have, and we have had many debates in the U.S., for example, regarding women's rights to reproductive rights, as well as birth control, and that have become quite conservative, actually, in the United States. I'll mention just that example, but across the world, whether it's the liberation of woman or control of a woman, nonetheless, the woman is the question of the community. So, on the side of questioning of the community, it appears to be that the woman is carrying on her body, in her behavior, in her position, and in her movement from the private to public space and the other way around. She is the side where we're questioning the values of the community, measuring and regulating the same. So that has become very important to me, that in the way in which Alberto set it up for me, and I'm just sort of rounding off that discussion to set up further reasons for which I have chosen to study women's movement and global migration as a way of, or as a place for devising something very positive. I hope you will find it positive. Another way he has set it up for me is he has spoken about Heisenberg's principle, according to which scientific truth is actually construed and affected by the intentionality of the observer, by the tool of the observation, as well as the object or phenomenon of observation. And that in that sense, tying on to my yesterday's discussion about the significance of all relationships, and how we as subject are relational, processual and relational, is that we have inquiry has become now a relationship. of different perspectives, and inquiry and observation are a matter of interference with phenomenon. There is no such thing as neutrality in that sense. And this is very important to me because my theory of subjectivity was derived from a notion, a concept, and a term in quantum physics called superposition, derived from the concept, but it also relies on the concept as a metaphor. And again, this is nothing new in terms of using interdisciplinary use of terms among different sciences or different disciplines. Art has been inspiring science, and science itself has been providing beliefs or framework of perception or paradigms for artistic expression or the worldview presented in literature. So in that sense, I am not doing anything that revolutionary, but I am relying on that term and the concept and the worldview by extension. So what I have done, I have looked into the global migration of women to see what it is that happens when a woman comes from one set of regulations and walks into another state with a completely different mentality, different regulations, potentially, or very often, different language. And oftentimes what we have seen is there's an enormous possibility for evolving and self-expansion, but there could be an extreme danger of double violations or very traumatic readjustment to another set of regulation that could be felt as stripping away. I intentionally use that pun intended with that word. It could be felt as stripping away of all values. They may be all of a sudden uncovered or exposed in the public or insecure in a huge place as opposed to a small one they came from. That's one way. Or they can experience a narrowing of perspective, a tightening if they come from a very liberated by Western standards country and come to a small one and things like that. They can feel confined. So there could be a sense of double disorientation and double violation, or multiple, I should say, violation in that sense, while also then a great potential for self-expansion, self-expression, education, getting a sense of success, getting multiple jobs and multiple languages and things like that. So it's a very ambiguous place that they find themselves in, but exactly because of that ambiguity, there's a great potential to tap into their experience and to understand what we can derive as knowledge and as potential for our own subjectivity in general. So what I've done is a twofold examination. One came from considering multiple theories of subjectivity that have been already present. And it would be too long and too much to go into that, but I'll just mention them. Some of them are such as the idea of the traditional unified personality. Another is the fragmented individual, and they all resonate or correspond with a particular period in history. For example, the notion of the fragmented individual and its representation in literature coincides or emerges along with World War I and the trauma of massive killing and the experience of that scale of destruction. And many of the writers and artists were in the front, and when they came back from the battlefield, that's the reality shattered self that they have written about or represented. So politics and aesthetics come jointly yet again, that I mentioned yesterday. Then we have the idea of a hybrid. For example, the very famous theoretician of the hybridity is a wonderful Homi Bhabha, who developed the idea of a hybrid individuality, especially in the modern times with the shift, with the movement, with migration. I wanted to take that a little bit further, exactly because hybridity does entail something greater than the sum of its parts. but typically it does entail two entities, predetermined entities that mash, that amalgamate, and out of that comes something that is synthetical. And I wanted to do away with the idea of the predetermined entity that comes as self-substantial into that mix to begin with. So I came upon a beautiful book that is called Stranger to Ourselves by Julia Kristeva. She's a Bulgarian philosopher and psychologist who lives in France. So she is an emigre, particularly an exile, an extraordinary woman who has written a book called, amongst others, Strangers to Ourselves, in which she actually speaks of not only of the modern condition of forced movement, dislocation, refugee status, voluntary move, the capacity today to the privilege of being able to move and roam, but she actually takes it also further and says there's a part of us that is strange to ourselves in this world, and that we have a part within us that feels always estranged partially or distanced from our own most immediate experience. So these are some of the theoretical things that I have taken into consideration in order to be able to insert my discussion of subjectivity. So on one hand, we have theoretical concepts that I had to follow through, and on the other hand, I had to look into the experiential aspect of it. Literally, look at the demographics, look at the experience of these women, and then from there, look into the literature of the women that have written about their experiences, and from there, understand further. So I have taken it in my research, then in my work, I have actually narrowed it down to women coming to the United States, particularly because of the powerful situation of the United States in the world, because the empire, the U.S., Western I should say, but particularly the U.S. Empire has already enmeshed its history with the history of the countries of most of all of those women. So say the impact between, the historical impact between Nicaragua and former Yugoslavia or Montenegro is not going to be as extensive, as significant as the impact of the U.S. and former Yugoslavia. Multiple times, and most recently after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the bombing of Yugoslavia and the dissipation of the country. For example, so these women coming to the U.S. interestingly have preset historic stage, some kind of baggage, luggage, historical and social, socio-political and economic, that they're bringing with themselves as they come to this foreign country, which also culturally is no longer foreign because of the global domination. It has become a global cultural domination, whether that's skewed representation through Hollywood or pop music that is one-sided. That's not all of America for sure. But that is, those two aspects for me had to be conjoined to come up with this theory, because I want to make sure that this sounds like a fine theoretical work, but I want you to know that all along I have paid close attention to the lived experience and felt history, all the way grounding it to the body, because let's not forget, to bring it back to the discussion of women, when we come to the border, when we come to the customs, our bodies are monitored for sickness, for pregnancy, for vaccination. Then when you get into the country, you are at a different altitude, breathing different air, drinking different water, acclimating to different climate, eating different food, having a different sense of orientation or disorientation and things like that. So this is felt history from which it emerges, and in the looping back effect between the bodily experience and the development of consciousness and how they affect each other mutually. So when I looked into this book, yet again, guess what I found? Julia Kristeva traces the literary history of migrants and points out incisively, It is noteworthy that the first foreigners to emerge at the dawn of our civilization are foreign women, the Danaides. Our civilization is apparently going to refer to the Greco-Roman heritage and then carried forward into the Judeo-Christian mythology and onward into our civilization. I am not going to let us off that hook just yet, unless we are aware of our mythical and frames and our belief systems. We cannot be claiming liberation, and especially we cannot be claiming big liberation in comparison to some other that we might consider backward countries or societies. I'm very sensitive to that. So we work within Judeo-Christian and Greco-Roman framework, and we might as well announce it. So the story of the Danaides is that there were 50 daughters who refused marriage, forceful marriage. This is significant. And they flee the country. They did not fare very well. But these are exiled women because they decided to disobey. And this is not the first story of female disobedience, right? Again, Alberto was speaking about Eve. And she is the unruly woman that is the culprit for our own human condition, according to this mythical reference. That she's the mother that gave birth to us into this terrible bodily experience, but also the woman that caused our expulsion from Eden. Yes? So, in her book, Strangers to Ourselves, A Poignant Study of Foreignness, Julia Kristeva traces the literary history of migrants and points out incisively. It is noteworthy that the first foreigners to emerge at the dawn of our civilization are foreign women, the Danaides. In this foundational myth of Argos, the 50 daughters of Danaus were ordered to marry the 50 sons of his brother, Aegyptus. In this exilic story of these itinerant women, it is crucial to point out that not only were the Danaides fleeing their native land, but particularly the laws of that land and the enforced marriage. The defiance of such a forced enforcement prompts their flight. Beyond Greek antiquity, we can further trace our civilization in the originary expulsion and lapse of the Judeo-Christian tradition, within which, too, the mythical exile, as well as the notion of otherness, are found in and founded on the female disobedience, which then in turn, apparently, or according to this cultural claim, requires to be monitored, disciplined, and regulated, unless it go out of bounds again. The notion of disobedience is invoked here resonantly with Henry David Thoreau's understanding that it is, in fact, one's higher duty to be disobedient to an unjust cause and unjust government. Human condition and human history, as we know them, begin with the expulsion from Eden, for which Lilith, an older figuration, or an older woman from the Bible, which we often forget. She was also an unruly woman, for which Lilith and Eve were not given the credit as foundational mothers. Mind you, the civilization, the human condition, are founded on their disobedience, but they don't give the credit as founding mothers of anything. But were expelled as monstrous begetters of human suffering. Manifold women's exile starts from their initial, fundamental position, which puts them outside the border of symbolic language, which organizes social institutions and laws, governs the production of sociocultural meaning, and renders women muted historical subjects. While neglected and underrepresented both as a mythical and a historical subject, migrant women have become the decisive markers of our contemporary times. In these times of dramatically increased international mobility and migrations, we're witnessing an unprecedented number of women on the move. Pun intended. The mythical reference to women as figures of sociocultural otherness and to migrant women as unruly foreigners who unsettle multiple sociocultural borders, thus sets the historical stage for the discussion of women's migrations, from which tend to be enforced, violent, and driven by socioeconomic necessities even today. So I want to read from an amazing book of one of the writers that I've studied. Her name is Etel Adnan, Eteladnan, and the book is wonderfully called In the Heart of Another Country. So we have an embeddedness and a folding in, which could be a sense of comfort in cushioning. It could be also constraint. It could be also multiple frames that complicate your existence. She is a Lebanese writer. She is, her mother is Syrian. Her father was Turkish. Her father is Turkish from Syria. Her mother is Greek, Orthodox Greek, born in Lebanon, speaking multiple languages. She has lived on multiple continents and to this day divides her life between San Francisco, Beirut, and Paris. This will be significant. The story of this woman and her example is significant. And speaking of the politics, she says, the state of man and a woman together already form a state. There's everything between them, a principle of authority, a government, laws of behavior, embassy and representation, diplomacy, weapons, periods of peace and war. They also constitute, to make things harder than for matters of state, two different species. When they meet, they sometimes ignore each other, sometimes they climb on each other like a pair of monkeys. At other times, a current of cool air passes from the one to the other. There is love. And then there are times when at their contact, a short circuit happens and they burn each other and leave nothing behind them but a spot on the sun. Etel Adnan is also lesbian, an artist, a writer, miniature creator, painter, and a speaker. She says, but being a woman, I am invisible. I have to hide my obsession for ants. And there is a reference to Walden, Thoreau's Walden, Henry David Thoreau's Walden. But being a woman, I'm invisible. I have to hide my obsession for ants. They pursue me. If a woman went to the marketplace and cried for help because ants were climbing up her legs, some men would throw themselves between her thighs and search wildly for the tiny beast in order to relieve her from her fear and to hurt her too. But she would be arrested and thrown into an insane asylum until she hallucinated and the water that fell from the faucet became a thick stream of black ants. In that case, I would pull up my blanket of flies and sleep. So this is the one woman's perspective on subjectivity, her own, unbound in the world, in the greater world, and what happens to it, where you see an enormous contraction that counters the expansion all the time. But then again, that's how life happens, between a contraction and expansion in the flow. And the reason I'm using the word subjectivity is manifold, and I can relate it to this passage. First of all, subjectivity refers to deeply subjective experience of the world that is carried forward within our consciousness and to our consciousness to process. It's qualia. It's a highly subjective experience of the world on which we base our understanding, our feeling of the world. Then the second element to subjectivity refers to the process of identity formation. that is also built on this qualia and in the relational, in the relation between the self and the world and the environment. And the third aspect of subjectivity refers then to representation of the self in the world, the way we appear in the world, the way we express ourselves in the world, the way we choose, if we can choose, how we represent ourselves in the world, yet again, aesthetically and politically. So the way in literature she's explaining her experience from multiple cultures and the effect it has on her as a woman, and as well as a sense of social agency in the world. And that's why I spoke about mythical representation of women, but I also spoke about women as historical subjects being muted. So subjectivity as a sense of individual social agency, potency in the world, whether you have it, you don't, you have a sense of being able to have it or not, and on and on. The question of choice continues to this very day as a contemporary issue. So women today are experiencing drastically greater possibilities for voluntary movement, as well as a dire likelihood of enforced displacements. Their migrations are happening within the context of global market economy, whose means for the movement of the people and the capital may be highly advanced, but its labor division and profit sharing run along well-entrenched lines of racial, ethnic, class, gender hierarchies. In their introduction to the collection The Gender of Globalization, Nandini Gunewardena and Ann Kingslover expound on the inequities generated by neoliberal globalization and what they call feminization of poverty, highlighting the observation that, quote, current globalization builds on patterns created by centuries of colonialism and imperialism interacting with local systems of domination, end quote. They examine, quote, how local and global constructions of gender are employed in the operations of transnational capital to exacerbate women's economic and social vulnerabilities, end quote. Furthermore, the multimedia digital technologies are bringing greater number of people together while increasingly keeping people confined to virtuality. Many of these technological means, however, are enabling migrants to keep closer ties to their originally geocultural locales than ever before. So, granted that one of the key features of our times is global migratory movements, this paper examines how these contemporary trends and developments affect, inform, and reconfigure modern subjectivity, which in turn constitutes one's individuality and identity as socioculturally and econopolitically recognizable. More specifically, I trace and articulate the shift in and evolution of modern subjectivity through the emergence of migrant women on the global scene, whose existence among different geosocial locales and value systems I name here as being in superposition. That is, synchronously multiple placedness in the world. Superposition here refers to subjective experiences and subjective consciousness as resources for individuality formation and formulation. The conception of an individual as she presents or represents herself and appears in the world. Furthermore, subjectivity refers to a subject as being called to act or called to action, as well as to a way of relating to others. As I explore the properties of the smallest scale social entity, a human, an individual, and a mobile physical system of a migrant, I turn to the language of quantum mechanics and theoretical physics for the term superposition for its greater conceptual capacity to elucidate the possibilities of multiple positionality. What I find conceptually productive in the term superposition is the notion that a physical system, such as an electron, exists partly in all of its in all its particular theoretical possible states or configurations of its properties simultaneously. But when measured, it gives a result corresponding to only one of the possible configurations. Thus, the notion of the observer not only as participant, but also as a reductive force, reducing multiple choices to one single observation. Similarly, a migrant's simultaneous existence among multiple social systems and multiple loci of her consciousness is reduced by traditional categories of national, political, and other forms of assumed identification and allegiances. The discussion situates the modern subject along the intersecting lines of race, ethnicity, class, gender, and in relationship, or rather away from, the universalized, disembodied, rationalized, and lionized individuality of more traditional conceptions. Working and developing away from such traditional conceptions, sciences and arts of our times and the burgeoning of the interdisciplinary studies have been informing and registering a dramatic shift in our general worldview. I align my understanding of the migrant subject and the migrant modes of existence with the famous Alfred North Whitehead's conception of process philosophy, embodied mind, and occasions of experience. Process philosophy identifies metaphysical reality with change and dynamism. It has its counterpart envisioning in the sphere of physics through Ilya Prigogin's distinction between physics of being and physics of becoming, and the understanding of reality as experiential, as a process of continual invention and reinvention, rather than a given material. Taking off from such philosophical-scientific perspectives, the emerging modern worldview is characterized by the notions of interconnectedness, participatory universe, transformational processes, and being as continual becoming. So I look at now the question of individualism. Expansion of our consciousness thus changes the conditions for individuation. Consequently, individualism as the key feature of our time needs to be rethought and reconfigured. In her meditation on the possibility of modern human bonding entitled Flesh of My Flesh, Kaja Silverman points out that insistence on uniqueness is narrowly defined individualism leads to the point at which we as unique individuals are bound to be rivals, if not enemies. And that is tying into what I've spoken about yesterday. I ask them, how can we conceive of individualism within and along the lines of interconnectedness? This was the question that informed my conception of subjectivity. And more specifically, the question of women. How can we protect women's emerging and precarious, vulnerable autonomy, and thus individual autonomy at large, as we focus on creating the new global community? I started by speaking about women as ectopic subjects, meaning out of topos. You may know the term ectopic pregnancy, and that's also relevant, referring to a woman's body. So they're always out of place, even in their own country, even in their own environment. There's something that I spoke about a minute ago that makes them feel that they're mute, invisible, or always somehow worrying, are they truly out of place? Are they proper, at their proper place or proper behavior and proper selves as expected to be? So women as those strangers to themselves and exiled within their own environment have multiple sense of estrangement or alienation that they experience. And to me, that notion was very important to start from there and only then to develop something very positive about it, something empowering out of it to say, if that is so, you are capable of experiencing and sensing multiple positions from always being not here and not there, here and there, here and not there, and not there and here. And this right here is a matter of limited choice, which can be expanded. Yes? So I will refer really quick, since I've spoken about flesh, really quickly to Etel Adnan's In the Heart of Another Country, yet again, to read a passage in which she speaks that all of a sudden the explosion of one's world in migration out of these tremendous constrictions, questioning of one's place, of being everywhere at the same time but not really feeling comfortable anywhere, she speaks of the positive capacity that in writing and in aesthetic present representation, she almost gained a whole new sense on top of the senses that we have, actual senses, physical senses that we have. Writing opened up a new line in the flesh of being. It's not only a tool, but a mode of apprehension of reality. It uncovered a new sense added to touch, hearing, and on. Writing was not enslaved by the written. The first act of writing was a mutation. So continuous straining between what's visible, expressible, and what is not visible, and not being able to express in this kind of existence, but it also presents itself as a tremendous benefit, and it could be used as a tremendous benefit. So the ectopic subject is a challenge to the understanding of identity because it is there where you are looking and it is somewhere else. As being in superposition, it is always not here and not there. In that sense, migrant women and their extreme situation are the sociocultural figures of utter difference, whose existence can be viewed as such being in superposition. And superposition is applied here for a conceptualization of the self as an evolving set of positions in relations. It is dynamic, it is relational, it is multipositional and diversified in the duality. Thusly conceived, it keeps a sense of unique positional configuration. You don't get dissolved, in other words, but you are mobile arrangement, always escaping one-dimensional categorizations while simultaneously allowing for multitude of affinities, intersecting, and multitude of solidarity. As gendered and mobile self-conscious spaces, migrant women's existences termed here as meta-lives highlight multiple loci of consciousness and modes of identification, and then emphasize the zones of their negotiations as existential, epistemological, and aesthetic distances of self-reflection. So the same distance that is tormenting you and always being out becomes an opportunity for greater self-reflection and becomes a way of knowing. That's why I said epistemological. It becomes a new way of accessing knowledge, self-observation, observation of the world. So where I've taken this notion is from understanding of the woman's fundamental sense of being an ectopic subject to being in multiple positions, and then to ask the question, well, if you have multiple positions, what is it that holds them together? What still holds you if you're not, if I say that we're not fragmented, rather I would call us a plenum. I'm calling us a wealth of possibilities within one, which refuses to be reduced. It is that migration happens to be a more intense way of expansion. It is typically something that Alberto also spoke about, set of values, set of beliefs, and it's also a social field that tends to narrow us down. But it is a very reductive process, so that we have people who will pursue only certain career, who will choose to focus only on one profession or one interest, under the belief that you have to sweat blood and tears and to be focused. If you want to excel, you might have to only choose one thing in life and only to be one thing. To prove ourselves, we dress certain way, we behave certain way, we go to certain places, align with people only of certain class or certain grouping. In any case, you can imagine in which way we organize our lives. But even as we do so, unavoidably in our lives, we're bound to perform multiple roles because of all the other people in our lives. So whether we want it or not, we can be a pianist within the one framework. We can be a pianist, a father, a son, a teacher, a caretaker, and multiple roles that one performs. But beyond just changing hats, my idea was that you can have a conscious expansion into multiple positionality, which they have the women have developed are developing a privilege, conscious privilege out of their marginality. Being on the margins, on the fringes, have provided them a challenging, but then nonetheless a privileged position from which they're able to expand now. So a social field narrows is done, and it's a very violent move. And I will ask you, how would any of us like to be seen as case? We feel extremely reduced. A case of immigrant. You're an immigrant. You're a case of cancer. You are a divorced case. You are an orphaned case. You are a colored case. You are a gay case. And you spoke about that. It is extremely violent to be experiencing that, but also it is extremely violent to the psyche of the observer. As you have spoken, they are actually dysfunctional when they do that to another. They may be living in an enclosed world in which they may feel security, but by way of our relational subjectivity, we're bound to break through that. We're bound to experience a crisis in life where we may get help from this, Lebanese artist who happens to be lesbian and who might save your life. Then that will actually, truly, manifold differences will make you question in times of crisis how you are going to perceive that person and what that person means to you. That's a kind of an extreme case. So Jacques Derrida, in his archives, and the renowned philosopher who himself was an exile, he's a Pied Noir from Algiers, French Jew who was born in Algiers and went back to Paris after the liberation of Algiers. So speaking again of another who has experienced multiple complexities of existing among multiple systems of values and beliefs. He's the one that says, as soon as there is the one, there is murder, wounding, traumatism, self-determination as violence. So he actually explains how we devise justifications for killing another on the basis of such limited understanding. So once I have found the term and the concept of superposition, I chose to develop an idea of an exquisite individuality that is James Joyce, speaking of his exile, called it post-exilic eminence, a sense of excellence that one can draw on in the post-exilic situation. He was the first to speak of that trauma as something that gives you excellence. That kind of individuality, however, when it comes to women, I have characterized as a delicate, difficult subject in continual seeking, marked by fine discrimination. And the pun is intended here. There are finer and finer ways, more refined ways of discriminating against them, but their capacity for fine perception to discriminate that way is increased at the same time. So I consider that as an opening, first and foremost, unto oneself. Superposition is not only a realization of the multiplicity within the self, but also a gathering of one's positions into a collectivity from within. And this is where I took the discussion of the multiplicity of the self into a positive conceptualization of the modern community, and that's why I intentionally used the word a gathering of those positions. So superposition as collectivizing from within becomes a necessity for the possibility of modern community. Engaging internal differences so as to relate to others along multiple lines of identification, alignment, and association. Such subjectivity configuration recreates and co-creates multiple ways of calling upon each other in mutual recognition. And that is the key to this aspect is recognizing each other in the way we appear, and I mean even physically the way we appear to each other, but also the capacity, building a capacity to reach out to each other, to call out on each other, to go beyond something that was considered to be politically correct or culturally tolerant. To tolerate is not enough, but to recognize, like I've spoken yesterday, shared vulnerabilities, shared multiplicities of the self, that we are not reductive of each other, of the self first and foremost, and of each other, and to be able to empathically engage another, and not just tolerate, not just see, not just block off into a position or something like that. So I will really quick give you an idea of what this means in the current moment of who you are, that you perform multiple roles, that you have multiple interests and multiple drives and desires that could potentially, if realized and expanded and developed, are giving you multiple ways of engaging another and expanding your networks, expanding your social and emotional and spiritual intelligence, and engaging a greater number of people. By extension, that will put you in the place of leadership, if you so desire unavoidably, or if you not desire, you will definitely inspire and augment the lives of others. Also tying back into what I've said yesterday, we are that kind of continuum, and we're in that superposition even across not only space, but time-space continuum generationally, and gives us a sense of responsibility, calling upon our ancestry about the collective experience, as well as being conscious of what you are creating for the ones coming after you. So it's a cross-cultural, cross-geographic, cross-regional, and it's cross-generational capacity that the concept has. And Adnan gives another example, very moving, that I want to give to you, read to you, in which she speaks of the kind of expansion that she has experienced in a moment, that kind of ecstatic feeling or the peak experience of which Alberto spoke. Gives you a sense of her torment as well, out of which that kind of joy came, by contrast. The dramatic and rather hopeless search for the past haunts our nights and obscures the present. But I crossed oceans just to catch the remembrance of a certain Easter day of my childhood. I walked the street leading to the school around the corner from my house, sat in a cafe with my head bent on my hands, looked endlessly into the sea, let my body sink in fatigue and pain. Suddenly, one day, the breeze flew horizontally, touched my ear, surrounded me. I shivered, my heart quivered, made itself forgotten. Then I felt soft and bodiless, weightless, lost sense of self and non-self. I became pure living substance, indefinable existence, and the breeze changed direction, blew softly to the opposite side, and it brought resurrection, brought that particular feast intact in its setting and weather in the present of my soul. I experienced a simultaneity of past and present. I lived the miracle of being a child and an adult, innocent and yet hyper-conscious. I was in April and in December in some absolute reality which was no abstraction. The weather itself appeared to be like the spirit in Greek theology. I was breathing in air as a child and as an adult in a climate redoubled into spring and winter like me. All of this already gone by the time it was noticed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mila. I was struck by the depth of this subject of what human subjectivity is, of which you have taken a part or an example and shown how rich it is. I was also struck by the fact that how literature deals with the subject in a different way than science does. And how there are two sides of the same phenomenon. Our subject is individuality and accomplishment, and obviously the core of what we mean by individuality is a subjective phenomenon in relation to the society. Society is, of course, we are objective individuals. We are physically objects. We have external objective characteristics as well as subjective. The society also has, as Alberto was referring in his comments on social construction, not only individually we construe socially, the society, his example showed how the society is construing socially. So it seems like we've got four aspects of reality to deal with here. We've got the social, the objective society, which Janani was talking about some of the aspects of that: coordination, specialization, structure, and systems. We've got the subjective elements of society, which we haven't fully gone into, but it's coming up in the subject. It's there, ever present in our discussion. We've got the objective fact of individuals who may be migrants, male or female. These are objective facts. And we've got their subjective reality. And somehow out of this all, we get something we call accomplishment. Human beings, objectively and subjectively, collectively and individually, these, if they are in fact four spheres, or that's itself an abstraction, interacting with each other in a complex way to lead to results. One of the reasons I keep coming back to examples is because in the abstract it's so complex, that's why yesterday I was trying to say, here are objective conditions in which Steve Jobs grew up. Subjectively, he internalized much from those conditions, but he also gave it a unique individual expression based on his own unique circumstances, not only the subjective aspirations of the society, and he had his own objective conditions in which he grew up, he evolved. So I'm just wondering, as we go through our discussions in the next 5 days, how we see the relationship of these four, if in fact it's valid to talk about them that way. I think what we see normally in the social sciences, they focus with the exception of psychology, focus very much on the objective collective in economics and political science, in management to a little lesser extent, but most management theory is focused on the external factors. But in political science and in economics, the emphasis is on process, structure, and all. How we put all of these together was a question that kept coming back as I was listening to you. Of course, what you said about, I think you yourself alluded to, what you said about superpositioning or imposition is true of every human identity. We are, as you said, in roles, we are simultaneously so many things, and our situation defines what comes out of us. And if today, which I think Alberto was alluding to, if today the social environment is more conducive to a freer, creative, individual expression, it's talking about how the subjective external relates positively to the development or the expression of the subjective internal. One thing I didn't hear, and I might have fully well missed it, but I was interested in, you had your 3 criteria about subjectivity. How would you define subjectivity?
The term itself that I've used, I've explained as these 3 different. There's 3 different, referring to 3 different aspects.
You mentioned one aspect, and maybe I missed it. You mentioned the process of identity formation and the representation of ourselves in the world, aesthetically and politically.
And the first one that I mentioned was the subjective experience, subjective conscious experience of the world. And that's why I mentioned qualia. And in philosophy they also have discussed the question of qualia, or the highly subjective experience of the world, of the self and the world. And it's interesting in the passage that I've read by Ethel, she mentions how these things push on you, press from the inside at night when you withdraw within yourself and in your dreams, or your secret desires in your subconscious and through your unconscious, that they push forth, that some of these things you can't, even if you wanted to, suppress, and they will, the more, and Alberto could speak about this better than I can, but the more you suppress, the more it will erupt in one form or another, if it's not dealt with. So that's some of the things that are very important to me, and this is a way of responding to Elena's comment yesterday. It was downshifting. You taught me that. I did not know that there's a, dare I say, like a hip expression. And I have a reason why I'm saying a hip expression. There's a long-standing tradition, and my Indian colleagues can vouchsafe for that. A long-standing tradition for men to shed the world at one point in their roles. So the men, if they could, they had to be decently situated to build their life enough for themselves and their family. While as they perform all these roles and functions in the world, father children, raise them, situate them around the age of 60 or so, it is expected of them to leave the family and to go to an ashram, to go somewhere where they can shed the world and continue devoting into that stage of life their time and their energy and their focus to spiritual growth. One more time, let me preface that with, the men could do that. We could not afford to, we would always have a child on our hip, whether our own or our grandchild, somebody would be on our hip. But that's how we develop, with another, for the sense for being for another. And that it has its own privileges out of extremely strenuous existence. Nonetheless, if you are recognizing them, it could be a tremendous privilege. So there's a long-standing tradition of doing that, and it's amazing to see that I've spoken before about people that, and Alberto also mentioned that, people that earn so much, that have so much, that their palate gets jaded. You cannot eat all the food in the world, or have all the women in the world, or men on the world, or you cannot eat your money at the end of the day either if you have, I don't know how many millions of dollars. That at one point, and Gary spoke about this, people set up foundations to feel that they are serving in one form or another, that's giving a different kind of fulfillment. For some of them, it requires to get to that point, and God bless them, as Roberto spoke about Renaissance and Florence. He said, if it were not for patrons with that kind of sense of hunger, then many things would not be possible because the merchants made it possible. So the reason I mention it as a hip thing, that apparently you have something to shed, you have something to leave behind, and you can make that choice to do that. What when it's forceful? What about sexual trafficking and child trafficking and things like that? How do you deal with that? So this is self-critique of my own theory when I ask that question. And I had to go about understanding those things as I also spoke about that other side of migration where it's forceful, where it's ravaging. And I say that these things are possible. This kind of expansion and the recognition of is possible only when your very life, your vitality is not threatened. And I will refer to that tomorrow as well in the discussion of personal crises as a vehicle for development. But that's something that's important to mention. Another self-critical move that I'll mention here, I can ask myself at the same time, aren't the women that are studying serving yet again? Even when they serve a figuration for a theory. You understand? That is why it was very important to me to read to you, to hear her voice, or to be conscious of my own femininity, my own womanhood in migration. That's why I constantly speak about theoretical and the experiential, intertwined, because I have to keep my own humanity in check as I'm doing this. So they are amazing possibility for alternative figuration and embodiment. And that's why it's important that I say embodiment, because I never want to lose sight of felt history. Embodiment of this new subjectivity which we're feeling, and this is what Gary's mentioning. How are these new conditions, as devastating as they may be, how are they actually conducive to greater self-expression, to being able to theorize, to feel, to expand and develop in this way, in fact, to start speaking about. And this is how we have evolved. Not just knowing and feeling yourself, then the notion of finding yourself. Now we're starting to speak about the notion of creating yourself. That's what's important. And that's what we are seeing in scientists are having to become creative, and they have had to become creative thinkers. That's why quotable Einstein, and the poor man has said on Facebook so many things, God knows if he actually said them. But quotable Einstein is exactly because of his accent on imagination, on play, on him sticking his tongue out, of breaking through the image of the prim and proper, stiff, pontificating scientist. That's why he is the darling, right there to rock and roll, and Rolling Stones, the darling of even popular culture, because he taps into breaking through those frames. So the notion and the luxury, I should say, again, of creating, speaking about creating oneself. And as the last note, I don't know if you have more questions or comments, but I will appear to you. I will appear to you in very personal terms. Everything that I've already shared is extremely personal. In fact, I have undertaken this research as a form of therapy. It's a very therapeutic experience. I mentioned my situation in my migration yesterday, But in that process, I have also really recognized the circumstances in which I found myself and really maximized them. So in the meantime, I have become a mother of two amazing people. I'm lucky, blessed to share my life with them. They're not mine. They came through me, and I'm lucky that way. I am a spoken word poet. I'm a published poet. I am in the community as an activist. I'm always keeping my humanity in check by being in the streets. I'm a professional dancer of multiple dance forms. And most of them, when I think about them, are from the fringes. I'm in theater as well, and I'm a nerd. I'm a total bookworm, and live a very simple life at home, but very flamboyant in life, social life outside because of those interests. And it still feels small. This is not about accomplishment. This is about self-fulfillment and being able to live out these aspects of myself. Whereas if we're being told that, you either have a club culture where women are decked out to the nth degree because that's the only way they live out that kind of theatrical self. There is no other stage. We have that popular culture. Or we have a culture that says you cannot appear that outside, or many either-ors. And it's actually utterly devastating not to be able to live out all aspects of yourself. In fact, I can bet you, to go back to the question of suppression, the more suited up you are, that's an accusation right there. We're talking about suit and tie. The more suited up you are, the more you will tend to develop some kind of dysfunctionality, if I dare say some perversities or something like that. Perversity, it's not on me to claim them or see them as such, but some kind of perversity in the sense that you're perverting yourself by having to hide a part of yourself to perform on another stage. That's fair enough to say, but it's not a judgment on another human. So that's why we have huge scandals with politicians that have, as if politician has to be married and on and on. We'll get there. We'll get there. We'll get a clown for a politician, or was that even a good statement? Or we already experienced that. But we'll get our different presidents, our different leaders, because they are expected in a very reductive way to perform and appear to the world a certain way. Then you have all these scandalous things about escorts, illegitimate children, and then tearing them down over the affairs and all of that. Again, one more time, this is not a judgment at all. This is actually an unfortunate statement, because I feel for them too, because they've been reduced, they've been suited out. So what I have done, for example, I have even maximized the fact that I physically appear in different guises to different people. So I get asked everything, whether I'm Latina, Middle Eastern, or Native American, Turkish, Greek, anything but that I'm where I'm from. And I use that rather than try to prove that I'm from this place, except that they most of the time have to Google it. So I do. I have demonstrated, covered up. I have went with Latinos where I needed to go, spoke about immigration. I went with all of them that saw me as such. I did not negate that. I walked that walk with them. So this is what I wanted to say. I mean, most of the time we don't want to be reduced, and I have actually empathically understood that one-dimensional vision and then went there in order to open up their world. But let's get real, open up my own. And that's what I've done.
I wanted to ask, consequential to all you have said, what, in your opinion, you could suggest or hope that every woman and man that are for a more democratic and healthy society with more full opportunities and equal opportunity for everybody would practically do?
First of all, the discussion of recognizing that within yourself you're already performing those roles, and when you say that to people, they'll tell you, oh, fatherhood is, for example, or motherhood is really hard. I'm enjoying this, but I don't know how to balance. Just the balance in one's life between partners of all kinds, whether you have a pet, a lover, a husband, children, professional partners, because of the way we are related, we're bound to feel pressures. And if you don't see them as wealth and recognize that they're augmenting you, then you have issue of imbalances or not knowing how to balance different domains or different relationships. So first and foremost, recognition that you're performing all those roles, and as you're performing them, you're expanding yourself and another and the world if you're doing that empathically. The second thing is for sure listening to those voices that conference and they're actually listening to those voices and calling them to conference with you, to the dialogical voices of the self that you have within you. Hear them, because you might be stuck in a job that is extremely making you miserable. And by proxy, by extension, you will be making others miserable because you're not at the place where you need to be. The good old, but truly valid, listen to your heart. What is it that you're hearing? Where are your interests and desires nudging you? What kind of interests to pursue? Knowledge, people, places, languages, skills, capacities, to develop them. Again, you are developing as network, meeting more people, then enabling them to be exposed to the difference that you are, and the other way around. And the third it should be multiplicity. I should be walking my talk, right? Everything should be multiple, not either or 1, 2, 3. But for the practicality's sake, as far as you speak about the political world, I have already said that I had to be present in the streets and put myself in the place of feeling like a political subject, whether I was recognized or not. For example, I walked in the U.S. and I got a green card. And the second generation Mexican child is still a legal alien. So, selflessly, if you are able to recognize that at one point you are in the disadvantaged position and it is yours, it's upon you, you're being called upon, first your own voice of integrity, to show up in the street for those people. It's not fair. It is not fair. So you have to grow out of yourself and outgrow yourself continually through that. And as a society politically, will have to be much bigger. I don't see a way of doing that but by doing this individually, because as a society I feel nobody's going to give us something from the top. Although there are people and they're developing too, but they're within structures that are also limiting them. So in order to grow, we'll have to see these multiplicities. Some of it has been happening through politically motivated, economically motivated, yes, the European Union and bringing borders down. I mean, I don't see borders coming down as soon as I would want to see them. But within what we have identified, passports and border lines and things, what can we do? We can at least do tremendous cultural diplomacy, if nothing else. That's the extent to which I can affect things politically and individually. And bit by bit, I mean, we are seeing tremendous atomization of the world, right? Countries want independence, are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, but we're also seeing tremendous integration in greater regions and greater, whether treaties or unifications. I mean, the less we're threatened by, and this is our experience in Yugoslavia, the less we feel threatened about dissolving into atoms, the more we'll be allowing for greater integration, and this is exactly what's happening. Otherwise, you're going to have a reactionary move. This is what's happening also, where you will have the greater liberation that is making some, like you were also mentioning, threatening to some that they withdraw into extremism, religious extremism, because they feel that all the ground is shifting. I have no more values. My identity, cultural identity, is being leveled by globalization. Those two sides of the coin of the globalization. One is leveling things for economic markets and leveling, they feel, or whoever feels, we feel, I feel, leveling identities, while the other one is opening possibility for greater unification across all borders, which the technology, internet, has only shown us how much we actually desire that. And that's the need you spoke about when somebody has a sense of the need of the people in relationship to Thomas Kuhn. So this is what's going on, and we have to be able in the current state to hold our ground in this sense, to be conscious of one's multiplicity and to speak of it will allow people to feel safe within their authentic selves. So you say, you are, speaking of my own friends, you are young 39-year-old father from Palestine who is devout Muslim, who was born in Palestine, but so young, brought to the U.S., that you fell in love with the U.S., and you are a leader in the Islamic community in Denver, you're a businessman, just to name some. Or you could be also a musician, painter, and all these other things. But I am intentionally bringing a case of my own friend because of the political situations and things like that. And you bet that there will be places in which this same person will stand extremely tall for the U.S. interest and for the U.S. culture, extremely tall. And then others will say, no, enough is enough. Or I feel as a victim here, or after 9/11, I would have many stories to tell you about the same man. Or peel off both of those layers in the name of fatherhood, providing as a businessman for his family. If we do not tap into each other's multiplicity, I will have no way of accessing that person. Being born in the Orthodox Christian tradition, being a woman, his relationship with women, we don't even know. If we approach each other as firm entity in one particular thing, but it's also the possibility of telling others, you get to keep all the elements that you are. They're all yours. You are a compendium of multiple relational positions and associations. Nothing is being threatened. You get to keep all those and go Friday to the mosque, or I'm mentioning this particular example in the U.S. because of the sensitivity of 9/11 and all the other things, and you get to be all these things. And there's a way of holding them together with integrity by universal needs, desires, and values. Universal human needs, desires, and values, which is to, I mentioned them before, live, love, learn, leave legacy. Janani, I'm sorry, I just realized.
For just one point, it reminds me of the English language. It accepts words from all languages, it grows and it's accepted everywhere.
And again, coming from an empire, coming from a very, aggressive motivation, but nonetheless, we have managed to turn it to serve us these days. Some more, some less, but nonetheless. Alina?
Why not?
Oh.
Is it bad? Online common?
No, English has grown by not saying we will not accept any other words from other languages. It accepts words from, there are so many Hindi words in English.
By analogy to what?
And so in a sense she's saying it's a cross-fertilizing move, because we might have an opposition to, or not opposition, but English itself did not remain intact. By being adopted, even though it was imposed or at one point by interests, nonetheless, once you start using it and by adopting it, you infuse it, you change it in return.
Everybody's changed.
Yes. Olena, you were going to...
Yes. Thank you, Mila, for sharing your personal experience with us. I'm really struck with what you achieved in such conditions, in a difficult situation, like for you as an immigrant in the USA. And I also wanted to add about the problem of immigration. I don't have so many women immigrant friends, but I have a wonderful example of a person who stayed really a person being an immigrant, and you all know about him. It is Dr. Popovich, a member of the World Academy of Art and Science, and he, being 16 years old, was taken to Germany to work in the labor camps during the war, and afterwards he came to Canada and worked there as a lumberjack for for a year. At that time, he managed to learn English, having just the English-German dictionary and nothing else. Then he entered the university and became the best student of his course. And the story of his success continued during all of his life, and now he is happy to do what he wants to do. He created a foundation in Ukraine to help his native country to develop. And for me, it is really the best example of the resilient individual. And the key thing which helped him to become this, was the question of identity. He recently have written the book which is called Identity in Globalized World. This is the English version of the title of the book, and the Ukrainian one is Remaining Ukrainian. So during all of his life, everywhere where he was, he said, like, I'm Ukrainian and I'm proud of it. Just imagine that not so many people in Canada and in Switzerland, where he lived for some 50 years, knew about Ukraine, what's the country, that they knew the USSR and Russia and Ukraine, what is Ukraine. But still, he managed to create a feeling in other people, so that they were also proud to know a Ukrainian, something like this. And this was really amazing for me. I guess we also have to think about the identity as a key factor to to stay functional personality.
And this is from the example that you just mentioned. It's actually not just being functional, but becoming vibrant, fully expressed in so many domains and so many things that he has done. It's not climbing in succession one thing or another. I'm sure that within his psyche, the lumberjack is still alive, and he's very grateful for that part of him that he lived out. And then gave him capacities and skills to connect to the working class, or to realize another suffering in the condition which would have been zapped away from him if he didn't have an opportunity to do that. So this is about, I love the discussion of sustainability. Now it's resilience, but I really love the word vitality and vibrancy and things like that gives me a whole sense of being fully alive and present wherever you're at. So what I hear, and I have already heard amazing things about him, is only confirming. And it's important that you mentioned a man, so this doesn't feel like it's a lopsided thing. I just want to make sure that I have examined what I've examined, but these are possibilities that I'm bringing forth for the general sense of individuality, all across the board, all across the world, across the class, all walks of life, for all of us. In other words, we're doing disservice to ourselves and to others by not expanding our potential and realizing it.
Thank you. Wonderful comments. Great discussion.